Now we're going to look at row houses. Row houses are a fairly typical way over time that many cities had seen middle-class housing built before the 1900s. Although in many American cities there are very few of these kind of examples left, they're a fairly typical American way of living. And here in our diagram, to orient ourselves, we can see a block that's substantially composed of row houses. The typical thing about a row house is it touches its neighbors on the sides, but nobody's under you, no one's over you, and in most cases you're up close on the sidewalk, but as a result you get a very ample backyard. Here's an overhead view of typical row houses. We're going to start with a fairly atypical kind of row house, and that's in Harriet Square, which is a neighborhood in Minneapolis, which actually did not have a row house tradition. And in this case, at 10 units an acre, the architects had to make some decisions. How will we accomplish that density without having the houses touch, and yet the neighbors live in detached houses all around us? In this case, quite brilliantly, the houses touch, but at the upper stories, they appear not to. Large dormers, porches that jut out, and other elements create the illusion of closely spaced houses. In this case, that's the pattern in the neighborhood, but in this case, they actually do touch. Very gracious, large front yards in this case also echoed the neighborhood. Actually, the backyards are much smaller. However, in this climate, the really valuable thing is the huge screen porch on the front of the house. People in this part of the country will tell you that that's where comfortable living occurs. And if you have a large screen porch and a small backyard, but are near neighboring parks and kids can play out in the front yard and the streets, that's actually a terrific way to live through the extremes of that climate. Now here's an interesting example of a very different kind. Same density, 10 units an acre. Instead of a suburban, almost low-density neighborhood in Minneapolis, we're now in the heart of historic Charleston. Obviously no big front yard tradition here. These houses are right up on the street, and proud of it. That's a local tradition, but if you look closely, they actually are separated from one another, and they all have porches and balconies that face the ocean breezes and capture a lot of air circulation in the units. They're also only 1 unit deep. These are long, narrow houses with 1 unit below and 1 on top in some cases, or in other cases, 1 large house. But they have enormous backyards, which aren't seen in this photograph. So there's a clear trade-off here. Public space, streets is where kids play because they're narrow, not a lot of fast traffic here. Again, a tradition. And in this case, all houses actually have windows on 4 sides and cross ventilation in every room as a result of this very unique tradition in South Carolina. And this is, of course, low-income rental housing in an area of historic antebellum mansions. Now let's look at a similar density at a development in Southern California called Rancho Cucamonga Villas in a growing lower middle class suburban area outside of central Los Angeles. In this part of California, there's been a lot of single-family detached houses built, not particularly well, spreading over the horizon, and a need for affordable rental housing. Although there's a lot of fear about what low-income housing could look like because many of the residents of these newer suburbs are themselves people who have fled inner-city turmoil and strife. So they were particularly adamant that they did not want multifamily apartments. The developer had originally designed a multifamily apartment structure for this site, but working with the community and the architect came up with achieving the same density by creating houses which appear not to touch but actually do. In this case, a similar strategy to the one we saw earlier in Minneapolis at Harriet Square. So Rancho Cucamonga at about 12.5 units an acre. It's larger units, though, 3 to 4 bedrooms and some 5s. And the way parking is dealt with is kind of ingenious. There are a series of narrow parking courts alternating with what you see on the lower right-hand side, pedestrian courts. Traditionally, in this part of California, there's wide garage doors facing the street, and you never see the front door. In this case, ample presence of houses on the street and discrete drives that give access to the parking, and wonderful pedestrian courts where young kids ride their bikes and trikes around. In the rural area of Sonoma County at Lavelle Court, an almost opposite strategy was used to achieve a similar density. Now, if we hold in mind the Cucamonga example, which was 12.5 units an acre, so is Lavelle Court. In this case, Lavelle Court is composed of townhouses which circle around their parking. But the parking, which is in a perimeter loop, winds itself around an even larger open space at the center. Rancho Cucamonga had no one large open space, but a lot of private space for each house and for each courtyard. In this case, these homes have virtually no private open space except for their front porch, and all the space is public. So completely different results of a notion driven here by maximizing the public space, minimizing the private space, and accepting the car parked in front of the house as something that was a trade-off for having the full width of the open space, the porch, and the cars, all providing a very large separation across from one side of the development to the other. Again, 12.5 units an acre. And like Rancho Cucamonga, this site was zone multifamily, and to develop it looking like houses was rather novel and first met with skepticism, as planners said it is impossible to build houses other than eightplexes at 12.5 units an acre. International Homes in Chicago. Here's an interesting example. We're now at about 14 units an acre, where a series of scattered sites became available, and an architect developed a template floor plan, but different roof shapes so that it could be manipulated and inserted in different ways, and a certain custom feeling could occur as a result of these. In this case, fairly shallow front yards. You'll see just front stoops taking you down to public walkways on the left. But in a neighborhood on the right, a tradition of 15-foot setbacks. The houses were, in this case, pushed back 15 feet. All the lots in this part of Chicago have alleys on the back. That's where the cars are. And in all cases, fairly large backyards as a result of pushing the houses up to the front. In rural Half Moon Bay, California, what's interesting is a similar density is achieved in a completely different environment. In this case, the international homes were 14 units an acre. Here at Main Street Park, instead of looking like urban townhouses, everything is done to take these town homes and make them look like big detached farmhouses. And in this case, several are attached in a row but set back behind a new park that was provided by the developer for the community. The case of Main Street Park, the addition of the third floor and about 1/4 of the units freed up enough ground floor space that a large park was able to be given back to the community. So there's a direct trade-off between that density and height and a real public benefit. So here we are, very different feeling, a much greater contribution of public open space to the community, much less private open space. That was actually the goal of both the community and the developer in doing this project, because it was in a park-deficient neighborhood, and very large families, primarily farm workers, were expected to live here, and being able to play not far from your home in a large play area was considered a design requirement. Now let's compare both of these to Westtown 2 in Chicago. Westtown 2 is a little more dense at 17 units an acre. And in this case, a lot of the difference between the other two was simply shorter front yards and the ability to, in some cases, tuck a second unit behind a first. This was a scattered site approach. And you can see in this case the houses actually seem smaller than the adjacent ones. In fact, here's a case where the density is commensurate with the neighborhood, but because these had to be some of the units accessible and to keep costs down, the architect and developer team did not want to raise them a full story above grade. And in this case, there's a modest increase in the height that comes by ramping up to the front door. But more critically, tall hats or roofs were used to make the buildings feel as if they're in scale with the surrounding neighborhood. And the design actually is very compatible with a whole range of the architectural traditions in this neighborhood. And in this case, again, as in some of the other examples, 1 or 2 prototype designs were made to be adaptable to about, in this case, 30 different site configurations. Now we're going to move to Willowbrook. We're up at about 19 units an acre. And in this case, this does the opposite of many of the previous examples. This is a rough neighborhood. And in this case, as the townhouses turn inward around a totally controlled private open space. It's private. That is, it's public to all the residents, but no one in the surrounding community can get access to this development. 1 or 2 points of entry provide access to the entire site because safety and security were a real issue. Now, the street side of the buildings are not unfriendly, but you cannot get in a front door of a unit without passing a security guard. However, over time, the design was laid out in such a way that if that nature of the neighborhood changed, entry gates could be widened and left open, and this open space, which is now private, could actually turn into a quasi-public open space. And in this case, the private spaces of the private courtyards are right off the public open space. And this is at a density of about 19 units an acre. Southside Park is a co-housing development at 20 units an acre, similar in scale and very different than the earlier slide because it's totally orienting to the street side with the porches, etc. In this case, the neighborhood was considered safe, although there is a very small and attractive inner series of courtyards that provide that kind of semi-private space for kids to play. No private yards for any of the units, but in some cases they have porches on two sides. It's a community that came together, an intentional community, multi-income and ethnic community that wanted to come together in a large community building. So the density includes a rather extensive community dining hall and commons. One parking space per unit that's parked off of a public alleyway system was actually a very creative way to get the parking taken care of and allow most of the open space on the site to be devoted for people. At Jingletown in Oakland, California, at 23 units an acre, we're beginning to see elements of a third story, similar to as in Half Moon Bay, being the way you accommodate those extra bedrooms. In this case, the houses are very close to one another, although made to look as if they don't touch. Different paint colors, different trellises and planting achieve that kind of look. And the parking and pedestrian access is perpendicular to a very busy main road. In this case, the colored concrete signals that this is a semi-private drive, 8 to 12 units share it. Both people walking and driving come in. And you can see now clearly that the third floor is the way that the units expand up and still allow for private open space. At Waterside Green in Stamford, Connecticut, we were actually surprised when we did the research on this and found that they'd achieved a rather high density. It's 27 units an acre. Many people will tell you that this kind of housing simply cannot go over about 20 to 25 units an acre. And there's a clever pinwheel design. If you look at the design advisor, all of these projects are covered in greater detail. But in this case, the use again of a third floor element and traditional detailing allowed small open space to complement the housing and appear less dense. Now we're at Southside Housing in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Here the 29 units an acre that was achieved in part because of a mix of townhouses and some retained older industrial buildings that were retrofitted for artist live workspace. So you see this mixture, very typical of this neighborhood, which was a mixture of old workshops, factories, close to steel manufacturing plants, and working class housing. And because there's a tradition of 3 stories, a tradition of industrial architecture, and a tradition of extremely small backyards and alleys that provide parking, this is actually an acceptable density in urban Pittsburgh and still considered to be a very desirable density at 29 units an acre. Finally, at West Hopkins Homes in Aspen, Colorado, a full 3-story, incredibly narrow vertical townhouse. And that small backyard, parking off an alley, achieved an amazing 40 units an acre, partly because the dimensions of the site, the dimensions of the car, and the dimensions of the house all work together. There's virtually no wasted space, and the footprint of the houses is about 12.5 feet wide in some cases and 14 in others, so a very tall vertical way of living. Surprising range of density then in those kind of typologies.